Hello everybody, and today, as the title suggests, I have for you a review of every single ship in the US Blue Water Naval Line. This does come with a few caveats, just like my Japanese Naval Line review did. I will only be speaking on the researchable ships, not the premiums, and that's just because most of these are available to everybody. Some of the premiums are of course hidden from sale most of the time. And a lot of these ships do mimic the premiums to where you can apply them back to them if you happen to want to buy one of the premium ships. There are a few that are pretty good in this line. The other caveats are I'm primarily an arcade player, but a lot of these values will apply to realistic. You just have to take it as these values will be tuned down on some of the stuff like gun rotation, fire rates, that sort of thing. So it still applies, but just keep it in your mind that some of it will be slower. These ships are reviewed based on having most of their modifications researched, if not fully spaded, and the review will typically be in the order of speed and handling, into survivability and anti-aircraft firepower, into their main firepower, you know, the thing we're all there for, and my rating. The rating is based on my experience with each ship and how much fun they were to grind out, at least for me. And finally, if I don't mention anti-aircraft guns, it's probably because that ship has very little or none at all. It's not really a problem with this line though, as you will see. Speaking on that, an overview of the line in general. It is missing a few noteworthy ships in the researchable line in my opinion. Obviously the big one is the Des Moines class. There is really no reason we don't have a researchable Des Moines class, and I mention it every time I talk about the heavy cruisers. There's two of them. Well, there's one premium and one event Des Moines class that we have already. So really Gaijin has no reason why we can't have one in the tech tree. It really wouldn't surprise me if somewhere down the line they copy and paste one. Kinda like they did with the Japanese tech tree and adding in the Miyoko after I did my review, even though that's one of my favorite ships. A lot of battleships and destroyers can also be added in the future. The US had a rather large expansion of just different ship types and classes and everything else, so there's plenty that they can add in the future. And the final note I want to say on the line overall is there's no squadron ship or coastal. It's kind of weird. The Japanese have the Shimakaze. I thought the USS Bagley would be a squadron ship when they were first coming out with it, but it ended up not being it, despite it being kind of weird for where it is in the line. As per the line itself, it's a very roller coaster-esque line with some very good sections of ships, going into very bad sections of ships, and then back to good. So it's kind of weird in that aspect. It tends to have very good anti-aircraft with great engagement range over the entire line. Really, planes won't be that much of a threat to you when you're playing this line of ships. The other thing with these are all the guns of a specific caliber tend to use the exact same ammo and have the exact same characteristics. This is especially seen with the 5-inch guns on the destroyers and secondaries, and moving into the cruisers that all have the same gun caliber, of course. Repeating ammo types in this case will be heavily described on the first ship they appear on. This is just so I'm not repeating myself over and over with the characteristics of each shell. So if I say that this is the same as a previous ship, you may have to go back and see which one that was. I should mention which one it was in the review, but that will be where I say all the shell characteristics. Many main guns are also dual purpose, though in the game it's not super useful as you're not in many positions where you can switch shells and shoot at aircraft rather than shooting at a target you've already selected, so I won't really be mentioning it much. And of course, as for a few other characteristics you see over the entire line, the ships overall tend to be decently maneuverable with larger crew counts and decent armor for the most part, so that's all good. The torpedoes though basically never change. After like the first ship or two, they get into a standard torpedo and it's really not good. It's fairly slow, tiny warheads, and really doesn't deal any damage, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Most of the light cruisers and destroyers are insanely good. The battleships are kind of a mixed bag, but the TLDR as a whole it's a very good line to start with, just because you can learn to aim with the fast firing destroyers. But kind of once you get past them, there is a bit of a lag. Like I said, this line tends to roller coaster, so you may find that it slows down after a while as per the fun factor. But now we can get into each ship individually. I will have timestamps for each ship in the video, just in case you want to skip around and find specific ships, or if you've already ground part of the line and want to see what you're in for in the future, you can skip ahead to the timestamps. But to start with, we have the initial ship of the line, the reserve ship, the USS Litchfield at 3.3. This destroyer is pretty quick and maneuverable. It almost turns on the spot, making it amazing for dodging enemy fire, torpedoes that are slung everywhere, and of course teammates sailing in your way. It has 4 4-inch main guns, but can really only utilize 3 of them at a time due to the layout. They do have great firing angles though, but they do also have a slow turn speed, so while you can use them when you're heavily angled, when you go to turn they're not really going to track too well. The guns themselves are fairly weak but usable. They're hampered by a pretty slow rate of fire for a destroyer, and the shells themselves have a fairly high arc and long travel times, needing you to lead them a little bit more than others, which I would say is a bit of a learning curve at the start of the line, but these engagements at the low tiers tend to be fairly close in range, so it's less of a problem for this ship. It does get one 3-inch turret to act as a secondary located on the very back of the ship, which is kind of funny, but it's not very useful. It's got a pretty slow rate of fire, a very slow turn speed, and very poor angles of fire for many engagements. And to round it all off for weaponry, the torpedoes are extremely slow and have a small warhead, but you do get 12 of them with 6 on each side of the ship, and the torpedo launchers do have amazingly good arcs of fire, and the torpedoes for their tier have decent range. So they are fairly useful if you just want to send them down range and see if they can pick up a couple kills for you. My overall rating for this ship is a 4 out of 10. For a starter, it isn't too bad, but the guns leave a lot to be desired. And up next we have the other 3.3 ship, the USS Barker at, like I said, 3.3. It's just a slightly upgraded Litchfield, and when I say slightly, I mean very, very slightly. The only upgrades were torpedoes and anti-air, really. It's added 2 20mm anti-air guns. They attempt to kill planes, but you're not going to see them swat down everything around them, so it's rather mediocre in my opinion. The upgrades to the torpedoes are basically adding the same torpedoes that you will see as the rest of the US lineup. They are still extremely slow, and while the warhead is bigger, it's still not very much. And they also have a similar range to the USS Litchfield's torpedoes, so really it's not all that much of an improvement. My rating overall for this ship is a 3 out of 10. It feels like I'm just playing the reserve ship all over again with nothing really changed. Moving on up to 4.0, we have the USS Aylwin. This is kind of the true start to the US destroyer pattern with 5-inch guns and a center line configuration. And the ship is pretty fast and agile, but it does turn much slower than the previous 2 ships. You can really feel the extra size when you're trying to maneuver to dodge fire and stuff, and it's kind of teaching you that you're not in a basically helicopter of a ship at this point. And this ship can tank a surprising amount of damage for being a very early destroyer. It can take a pretty decent pounding and just keep trucking. And it also has a decent complement of anti-aircraft guns that try to ward off planes. They're probably going to not swat everything out of the sky, but they'll certainly try. The 4 5-inch guns that it does get can be utilized in full, with quick fire rates and a pretty fast traverse speed. And the shell flight times are still pretty long though. You'll find this is pretty common across the entire destroyer line. The SP common shells that it gets are basically semi-armor piercing, are absolutely great for dealing damage, especially up close. These will most likely be your primary shells that you'll use, but the high explosive is pretty good for nuking small boats. You'll find the SP isn't great for that. It is usable, but the HE will just annihilate everything. The firing arcs for these guns are fairly poor forwards, but they're pretty much better when aiming behind you. So in a retreat, you'll find that the guns are pretty useful in full, but when you're facing forwards, you'll probably have to show most of your broadside. The torpedoes themselves have a decent arc, but you'll basically have to be broadside to use them for the most part, and they are the same torpedoes as Barker, so really don't expect much from them other than maybe getting a couple ships to turn. My rating overall, 6 out of 10. It's a good preview of what's to come for the line. Up next, just because it's how the line is laid out, we have the USS Sumner at 4.7. The ship is slightly slower than its predecessor and less maneuverable, but overall it's still fairly agile. And the key point to this ship is it can take a wicked beating before sinking, assuming your ammo doesn't get smacked by an enemy armor-piercing shell or a large caliber high explosive shell. This is mostly due to the fact that it has a large amount of crew for a destroyer and anti-fragmentation armor over most of the hull, which is something you don't see on a lot of other destroyers. Along with that, the anti-aircraft battery on this ship is actually fairly impressive and will engage beyond 4 kilometers range. The only downside to it is it's mostly mounted midships, so your bridge will block the guns if a plane is engaging you from the front unless they're fairly high up. So just keep an eye out for that. It gets 3 twin 5-inch turrets with an even faster fire rate than Aylwin, and they all have fairly decent arcs of fire. The guns spin 360 degrees, so when you're maneuvering, it makes it very easy for these guns to switch sides of your ship. Like I said, turrets rotate extremely well, and it gets the same good shells as Aylwin, and this will continue for basically every 5-inch battery that you see in the line. Sumner can basically fight almost every ship you see at the tier, so it's definitely not a ship you should underestimate, and it is absolutely hilarious that you can basically fight everything. Light cruisers, destroyers, it'll eat them. It'll tear them apart. The only downside is you get the typical poor torpedoes for the US line, though you do get 10 of them split between 2 centerline launchers. It's enough to at least blanket an area and force players to turn or distract them from your ship, obviously. However, if you do want to use them, you'll basically have to be broadside to use them due to their firing arcs. Overall for this ship, my rating is a 9 out of 10. Brawling everything you see and winning is just extremely fun. Up next, we drop back to 4.0 with the USS Bagley. It's a fairly quick and agile destroyer for its size. The turning circle, however, can feel quite long, and like I said, this is due to the size of the ship. It also lists very heavily when it turns hard at speed, and this listing can prevent the torpedo launchers from firing until the ship is almost fully normalized. They are very frustrating to use in this aspect, and even in the replay in the background, you'll probably notice that I have a lot of trouble using them just because the ship is listed slightly basically all the time. It also has only slightly more crew than the reserve destroyer, so it's fairly similar in survivability to Aylwin. The 4 single 5-inch guns are still okay, though the rear 2 turrets share Aylwin's slightly slower rate of fire, so you'll find your ship has 2 different firing rates, which is kind of weird to use sometimes. And it has the usual 5-inch ammo, so it does have good shells overall. The guns have decent arcs of fire and quick turn times, and all turrets do rotate 360 degrees. The main feature of this ship, I guess, is the 16 torpedoes that it gets, but these are the typically poor US torpedoes, and they're split between 4 launchers with 2 on each side of the ship. These launchers do have decent arcs of fire. The main downside is, like I said, they won't fire if the ship is listing at all. And this would be a good loadout if the torpedoes were useful, but instead it's basically just a extra explosion risk for you, because if a shell hits you enough on the back of the ship, you'll probably just explode. My rating overall is 4 out of 10. The torpedoes are just not good enough to make this ship useful. Now we jump back to 4.7 and stay at 4.7 with the USS Gearing. The ship is basically the exact same as Sumner, but 1 torpedo launcher is replaced with more anti-aircraft guns, And the anti-aircraft guns on this ship are just impressive, and if any planes or light boats get within 5 kilometers of you, it will do its best to just shred them apart. The loss of torpedoes really isn't a detriment for this ship. You still get 5 for emergencies or area denial, and the single quintuple torpedo launcher does have a fairly limited firing arc, forcing you to be broadside if you want to use them. Basically, everything you'll see, you'll be dueling with your guns, and kinda like Sumner, it will just bully everything at the tier that it sees. It's absolutely enjoyable to do. These guns are awesome. My rating overall for this thing is a 10 out of 10. The loss of torpedoes raises its score because those things are fairly useless on these ships. Moving on, we have the USS Fletcher, also at 4.7. Now this ship is very maneuverable and quick. It lacks the survivability of its 4.7 BR peers due to the lower crew count, but it does get a lot of anti-fragmentation armor, so that is a very good positive for this ship. The more magazines and torpedoes that it does have versus its peers does mean it has a tendency to detonate more than them, so that is a fairly major downside of this ship. The anti-aircraft guns on it are also fairly light, but they are pretty threatening to planes regardless. Now for weaponry, this ship gets 5 single 5-inch turrets with the typical fast US rate of fire, super fast rotation, but not 360-degree rotation, which is a fairly big downside, but the fast rotation does make up for it. All the guns have decent arcs of fire, though you will find yourself blocking their firing arcs, fairly often if you maneuver frequently. As per the other 5-inch guns, these have the typical, very good US 5-inch shells, and the midships turret, while it's nice to have because it increases your firepower, does lead to more frequent detonations along with the torpedoes, just because typically everybody will be aiming for your midships, and when you have a magazine there, well, that just makes it a very easy target. You do get 10 torpedoes, speaking of them. They are the same torpedoes that everything else in this line gets, so they're pretty terrible. They are split between 2 launchers, and you'll basically be broadside if you want to use them. So really, they're kind of a downside overall. My rating for the Fletcher is a 6 out of 10. Really, I'd prefer the survivability of its peers over whatever Fletcher brings to the party. Moving on up, we have the USS Mitscher at 4.7. This is one of my favorite ships for the tier. It's basically a small cruiser and can fight ships that are way above its class, even taking on heavy cruisers that it can see. It's extremely quick in a straight line. It just doesn't turn well due to its size, and it's fairly slow to get up to its speed. Like I said, you have to kind of play this like a small cruiser because you just don't have the maneuverability of other destroyers. Now, as per its survivability, it does have a slightly larger crew size than Sumner, making it the most of any US destroyer, but a downside is it doesn't get any anti-fragmentation armor. Regardless, it can take quite a beating before finally sinking, and as an added bonus, it ranges and updates its targets extremely fast, so whether you're maneuvering or they're maneuvering, you'll constantly be getting updates on where you need to shoot. Now, the anti-aircraft on this ship is pretty light, but it has the potential to snag a few kills. The main feature though is the 127mm main guns. It may seem weird at first that you only have 2, but you'd definitely be wrong if you're thinking that it's weak. Both of these guns rotate quickly, fire extremely fast, and by extremely fast I mean that they have a 1.5 second reload rate. You'll just be constantly throwing shells downrange. These guns have great angles of fire and rotate 360 degrees, so you'll basically never have a problem with one of them being stuck in a turn while you maneuver. The shells from these guns also fly flatter than a typical US destroyers and have better penetration overall, so they are very good shells, making the ship very strong with its main battery. This main battery is backed up by 2 twin mounts of 3-inch guns that can shred most ships that it sees with their firepower, or at least if it can't penetrate, it'll take everything off their deck. They have an extremely quick fire rate on a ready rack system, so once the ready rack is empty, they do slow down, but they will still be firing slightly faster than your main battery, I do believe. Both of these mixed together are absolutely monstrous for firepower at this tier. It can, however, also get torpedoes and rockets. The torpedoes are rather poor and they're hull mounted, making them very difficult to use. And the rockets I've basically never had work, and I've never seen anybody get them to work. I think it just adds to your detonation chance, really. So I really wouldn't bother bringing either one of them, just because of that reason, and your main guns are already enough to terrorize everything that you see. Rating overall on this is a 10 out of 10. This thing is just a beast for its tier if you can get the aiming down for everything, and it will tear everything you see apart. Next we bump up to 5.0 with the USS Porter. This thing is just as fast and agile as the rest of the standard US destroyers, though it does list heavily in fast turns. This can lead to an inability to use your weapons as they can't depress over the side of your hull. The survivability also feels lower than the other destroyers due to facing better ships and having a smaller crew amount than the other destroyers. It does have some anti-fragmentation armor, but it doesn't really cover the magazines, so it's rather lacking in that aspect. The anti-aircraft guns on the ship are also fairly lackluster, so there's plenty of downsides to it, let's be honest. As per its weaponry, it gets 4 twin 5-inch batteries equipped with the standard, always good, US 5-inch shells. Overall, these are very good for firepower due to the standard high rate of fire and decent damage of the US shells. These main batteries do, however, have a slower rotation than the previous destroyers, but as far as destroyers go, it is still fairly fast. The arcs of fire on these guns are good, but they do lack the 360-degree rotation of its peers, which hurts with the slower traverse speeds that these turrets have, especially when you're trying to maneuver and get your small crew amount to survive a little bit longer. It does get 2 quad launchers of torpedoes with a quick reload system, meaning you basically get another rack of 8 shortly after your first rack, so you get 16 that you can spam out before going into a long reload. The downside is you have to be almost broadside to launch these, and you're a fairly easy target to hit at that point. And they are the typical US torpedoes, so they're really not super useful, short of distracting people maybe. Overall, my rating is a 7 out of 10. The firepower is nice, but the low crew counts and the listing problems really hurts its potential. Moving on, we come to the first cruiser that we will see in the line, the USS Trenton at 5.0. This cruiser is fast enough to keep up with many destroyers, though it does take a bit to speed up and longer to stop. And while the rudder is responsive, the turning circle of the ship is fairly huge, which, while it is nimble enough to dodge some fire, makes it a problem when you're actually trying to turn around. As far as its survivability goes, it does have more crew than the previous destroyers, but really not by much compared to, say, the other cruisers that it can see. And its armor is basically paper, especially in an up tier against 6.0, expect to basically just suffer. Always expect to get damaged and constantly detonated, just because it has some fairly large and spread out magazines, and its anti-aircraft firepower is rather light. It will engage some destroyers on its own at closer ranges though, which is somewhat of a positive. As per its main weaponry though, it gets 6-inch guns in 2 twin turrets and 6 single-barrel casemate turrets. The gun layout overall is weird, with the 6 single-barrel casemates being split between either side of the ship, but despite the weird layout, you can usually at least get 7 barrels on a broadside, with only 3 of the single barrel guns left out due to being obviously on the other side of your ship. The turret traverse is almost battleship levels of slow though, so if you do have to switch sides, it's pretty terrible at doing that. And all the guns have fairly bad arcs of fire, so when you do want to do a full broadside, you will most likely be broadside. The rear turret, however, does rotate 360 degrees, which does save you a little bit of pain if you're switching sides while advancing towards something. The reload on these is a lot slower than most destroyers you face, and the guns are fairly inaccurate, which makes them somewhat painful to use. And on top of that, the semi-armor piercing shells that you get are only slightly better than a destroyer's, and really these two things together don't make this ship a lot of fun. It has a really hard time fighting other cruisers that aren't lightly armored and broadside, especially since you have no access to an armor piercing round. And the shells themselves are still fairly floaty and not very good at range. You do get a couple 3-inch guns as a secondary, but they aren't very useful in my opinion. And on top of that, you get the typically bad US torpedoes in 2 triple mounts, one on each side of the ship. They do have great arcs of fire, and in my opinion they're still worth taking for close-in engagements or just surprising people with launches at range, but don't expect them to do a ton of damage. It does, however, get a float plane. Though this isn't super useful at these tiers as the maps are smaller, there tends to be a lot of destroyers and PT boats, so really you're not going to get much use out of it. It is noteworthy though. My rating overall is a 3 out of 10. Most of the time, you're just a target. Moving on from that, also at 5.0 we have the USS Sumner. This thing is just a porter with a different torpedo layout and slightly more crew. Its anti-fragmentation armor is reduced to only cover the engines, and it gets 12 torpedoes split between 3 quad tubes and no quick reload. The torpedoes are still the same bad torpedoes, they still have to be basically broadside in order to launch, so really nothing has changed here. It does, however, seem to list significantly less and can keep the guns on target through turns, so it is quite a bit buffed in that regard, making your guns a lot more useful when you're trying to maneuver. My rating overall for this thing is a 7 out of 10. It really isn't all that different than Porter. And the last ship we have at 5.0 is the USS Raleigh. It's a Trenton, but with a lot more anti-aircraft, extra 3-inch secondaries, and a much higher crew count. The anti-aircraft on this thing is extremely handy with the amount it has, and it will threaten a lot of planes. The 3-inch secondaries that have been added still aren't very useful in the number that were added to this ship, and even with the extra crew, this thing just feels like you're playing Trenton all over again, just with more anti-aircraft guns. So basically my rating overall for this thing is a 4 out of 10. It gets the extra point for the addition of anti-aircraft guns, and that is all. Moving on up to 5.3, we have the USS Atlanta. This thing is just a powerhouse at its battle rating, and really I didn't need much of an excuse to play this again. This thing is fast, almost as fast as most destroyers, with a very responsive rudder, though it does have a long turning circle and very heavy listing that can prevent engagements or throw off your aim, so careful about maneuvering very heavily when you're in a gunfight. The crew count on this thing is fairly decent for basically an oversized destroyer, and the hull is completely covered in anti-fragmentation armor. This thing is very well protected for a light cruiser. It can make many destroyers, and some light cruiser shells struggle to even damage you, and it really makes you feel very survivable up until you see a heavy cruiser or a battleship or a later light cruiser that will just eat you alive because you have a lot of ammo to detonate and a lot of surface modules that are very, very easy to destroy. As per your anti-aircraft guns, it's fairly light outside of the dual-purpose main batteries, but they are still fairly effective for their small number and will engage near 5 kilometers out. The main batteries, however, are the star of the show. They are the standard Sumner gearing style dual 5-inch guns, and you get 8 of them in total. 6 of these are mounted centerline with 3 super firing on each end of the ship and 1 wing turret on either side of the ship. These things have the quick traverse speeds and the high rate of fire as per usual with these turrets, and most of these do rotate 360 degrees, so if you are maneuvering, you will be able to switch between sides of the ships fairly easily. All the guns have fairly good arcs of fire, though the long ship itself makes for a fairly easy target if you're only angling and not weaving around. Overall, the fact that you can get basically every gun on target minus 1 wing turret Makes for a very devastating broadside, especially coupled with the usual 5-inch shells for the US line and the good accuracy of these guns. The semi-armor piercing from this ship makes very short work of destroyers and broadside cruisers, though it will struggle against more armored targets or angled cruisers. It can struggle also to deal damage in full up tiers without any destroyers to prey on. And also with the ranges, it can struggle on large maps where it can't get into these closer ranges, and it struggles due to having long shell flight times. So really, broadside, close range engagements with destroyers or early cruisers are your bread and butter. It does get 2 quad torpedo launchers, 1 per side. They're the standard poor US torpedoes, but do have good firing arcs. In my opinion, still worth taking, similar to the previous Omaha classes. My rating overall, this thing is a 10 out of 10. It is the boss ship of the mid-tiers in my opinion, and I always hate to face it. Up next at 5.3 as well, we have the USS Portland, and if you're like me and you're coming from the Japanese line, you think that the first heavy cruiser that you see is going to be a lot of fun because it was in the Japanese line, and then you're disappointed when you take this thing out. As per the ship itself, it keeps Atlanta's fast speed, but is rather slow to accelerate and decelerate, but it is fast to start turning, though it does have a long turning circle, making dodging fairly easy, but turning around not very fun. It does get a large crew count for its tier, but its armor is basically paper. It's absolutely not a frontline ship, and while it does have some armor, these will only hinder light shells when it's angled, but any flat spot or broadside can be penetrated by even destroyer shells. The magazines on this ship are very, very easy to find and penetrate, and sometimes people even penetrate them when you're bow on, so they're really, really exposed. Most of your ship is flat, and it's a very large, easy target at the tier. But if you want a positive for this ship, the anti-aircraft firepower is good and can reach out to engage at about 4.5 kilometers. As per its main battery, this is the first of the 8-inch armed cruisers. It gets 9 guns and 3 triple turrets with 2 super firing on the bow and 1 on the aft. These guns are slower to rotate than some battleships with fairly weak protection, so expect to lose these turrets a lot. The rear turret itself has a very poor forward firing arc, but the front turrets can aim behind the ship fairly well, making it pretty nice if you're in a retreat situation. The reload on this thing though is terribly slow at near 20 seconds, and the shell arcs are quite high compared to other heavy cruisers, requiring you to lead a little bit more than them. The guns are accurate at least, and most of the shells will land, but it does show more dispersion beyond 10 kilometers, so they're definitely better when you're up closer. The high explosive shells that it gets do have a lot of explosive power, but they aren't based fused, so they'll mostly be exploding on the surface of enemy ships. Both semi-armor piercing shells struggle against anything that's angled or moderately armored, and the armor piercing shells that it gets do have good penetration but barely any explosive filler, leading to very little post-penetration damage. Basically, the shells that these ships get, or rather this ship, kind of struggle in up tiers, especially due to the long reload. Overall, semi-armored piercing is kind of my preferred due to having some explosive filler and the potential to actually penetrate. The shells overall really are fairly inconsistent with damage anyway, and you can lose in damage per minute fights with basically destroyers if they dodge a couple salvos. You do get a handful of secondaries with 4 5-inch secondaries on each side of the ship. They do only get high explosive shells though, so they're minimally effective on most targets. And the secondaries tend to arc higher than the main battery shells, causing them to require a different lead than the main battery. So really it leads to them not being effective at all. It does get a float plane, but this leaves you very vulnerable, especially since your ship is already very vulnerable. Overall, my rating for this thing is a 3 out of 10. At the same BR, I'd rather just use Atlanta. After that, we have the Northampton at 5.3. It's basically the same as Portland other than a few things. Its anti-aircraft firepower is worse, being only slightly better than Atlanta's. and it has significantly less crew than Portland, making you a lot easier to sink, but you do have a thicker hull by 6mm, so it really doesn't change that much. The rear turret does, however, get much better forward firing angles, so it is a little bit nicer to use when you're trying to weave and dodge around. Rating overall, 4 out of 10. It does play nicer despite some of the downsides that it does have versus Portland. And to wrap up our 5.3 ships, we have the USS Pensacola. This ship is similar to Portland again, with less crew, and the anti-aircraft firepower is pretty light, but it does gain an extra 8-inch gun and a different turret configuration. It has triple turrets firing over twins on both the front and the back of the ship, though the rear triple turret doesn't have great forward firing arcs, but they all do have good rearward firing arcs, which is pretty handy when you're running away from the enemy, which you'll find yourself doing a lot in these cruisers. The guns being separated into 4 turrets does mean you lose less guns if one is damaged, but it does mean more magazines that can be hit, making this ship primed for detonation just because you are lightly armored and it has the same problems as the other ones that have come before it. My rating overall is a 4 out of 10, 1 extra gun, 1 extra point. Shifting up to 5.7, we have the USS New Orleans. Now, this heavy cruiser does retain the speed and handling of its peers. It is fast and fairly quick to turn, but it does keep that long turning circle that the previous heavy cruisers had. The armor on it though is significantly better around the critical components of the ship, so you will see yourself surviving many more hits. It does have a high crew count and great anti-aircraft capabilities, so these will both significantly help with your survivability. Helping with your survivability is the ship has a lot lower profile than the previous heavy cruisers. That makes your magazines and engines a lot harder to hit as they're deeper under the waterline, and there's less ship above the waterline for the enemies to hit as well. On top of that, the ship tends to be fairly resilient to sinking from flooding and can sail around with water almost up to the deck level, which can be kind of funny because it puts your critical components that much further below the water and the enemies basically can't get to them. Despite all these positives and the extra armor, it doesn't really help against many of the battleships you see, and it really only helps when angled heavily against many of the cruisers you see. So if you happen to show a broadside, expect to not survive very long, because your broadside is pretty much the same as the other heavy cruisers, short of your magazines being a little bit deeper and slightly more survivable in that aspect. As far as your firepower goes, you do get 9 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch secondaries in a layout similar to Portland and Northampton, and the turrets are much better protected than the previous heavy cruisers, though they're still somewhat easy to destroy as far as turret armor goes. The rear turret once again has mediocre forward firing arcs, and for once the rearward firing arcs of the front turrets is even worse than that, so really it doesn't help you in either aspect. Despite the guns also being a different model, they share the exact same slowed reload rate and traverse rates of the previous turrets in the line, so you really won't feel any change there. The guns themselves are fairly accurate, but tend to show more dispersion beyond 10 kilometers like its peers, and it keeps the exact same shells as the previous cruisers despite being a higher tier and seeing more heavily armored ships. This can cause it to struggle against the larger ships that it sees, and really the secondaries aren't that helpful for you in this case. The last 3 secondaries as well on each side of the ship do tend to miss wildly unless you're completely broadside. It's like they don't really align themselves too well. And it does get a float plane once again, though you're pretty vulnerable already, and if you're using your float plane it's leaving you even more vulnerable. So my rating overall is a 5 out of 10. The reload rates really let the ship down. After that, we have the USS Fargo at 6.0. This is the first of the standard 6-inch armed US cruisers, and is great to play when not in a mainly battleship-filled match. The ship is decently fast and good acceleration despite being larger than even the previous heavy cruisers, though it does have a slow rudder and a long turning circle, and kind of feels sluggish to maneuver with. It is better armored than the previous heavy cruisers and has a good crew count, and the turrets are much better protected than, like I said, the previous heavy cruisers. The armor though won't protect you against battleship rounds, but they do lessen the damage from cruisers, which is pretty handy for once. On top of the extra armor, your modules inside your ship are spaced out significantly, making many hits on you deal less damage or even no damage at all because they just pass through where there isn't any modules. The magazines are really your biggest weak point, as they are right under the main batteries and bridge and are fairly easy to hit if they do end up hitting in the right area. And the ship also has no torpedo protection despite your slow turns, so it's kind of a downside there. Fargo is absolutely covered in anti-aircraft guns with a great around 5 kilometers engagement range and great damage. They will decimate planes that come near you. And as per its main firepower, it gets 12 6-inch guns between 4 triple turrets with 2 super firing forward and 2 super firing to the rear. These things are awesome. They have a quick rotation, great accuracy, and a great reload speed of around 7 seconds per salvo. Arcs of fire on these are both great forward and to the rear for all the guns, though when you are planning your engagements you have to take into account that the shells do arc very high and have a longer travel times at range, similar to the previous 5-inch guns that you have used. The basic high explosive shells on this ship do a great job of removing everything from an enemy ship's deck. They struggle to do more though. They're mainly used for clearing basically all the secondaries or easy to damage modules off the deck, and that's about it. The base fuse high explosive though is amazing and will penetrate surprisingly well, acting almost like semi-armor piercing, and it'll even penetrate into many battleships' magazines, just straight up detonating them. Both high explosive shells do have a lot of explosive filler for great post-penetration damage. Of course, one of them will do penetration a lot better than the other one. As far as the armor-piercing shells on this ship go, they're almost solid shot, having less explosives than even the destroyer semi-armor piercing, and pretty mediocre penetration overall. In my opinion, just load up with the base fuse high explosive and maybe a little bit of the armor piercing for certain situations, and your only issue will be when you see 6.7 plus battleships. In my opinion, these are great guns for grinding events. You can basically outcompete most ships in terms of damage per minute and just continuously beat them down by picking them apart with your very strong reload speed. As far as your secondaries go, you get 6 dual 5-inch secondary turrets. These are the same turrets and ammo that Sumner and Gearing had, so they are very good turrets overall. They are placed as 2 centerline behind the main batteries and 2 on each side of the ship. You can basically broadside 4 at a time, but a lot of times the anti-aircraft guns and superstructure will tend to block 1 or 2 when you do angle your ship. They share a similar velocity to the main shells as well, so you won't need to adjust your aim just to get hits with your secondary guns. As far as the 5-inch shells at these tiers, the high explosive can help with damage, but the semi-armor piercing shells can be surprisingly effective against many ships you can see. Overall, in my opinion, they're a great secondary loadout to complement the main battery. You do get a float plane as well, which can be useful at the higher tiers, but you are leaving your cruiser vulnerable, so it is kind of a downside. My rating overall for this ship is a 10 out of 10. It's leaps and bounds better than the heavy cruisers in my opinion. Next in the line we have the USS Brooklyn at 6.0. This is folded with the Fargo, so it cost a lot less to research. It is very similar to the Fargo in many aspects, one of those being its maneuverability obviously. It does gain anti-fragmentation armor over the entirety of its hull, but it does have significantly less crew when compared to its predecessor. So it's kind of a mixed bag on whether it's actually more survivable or not in that aspect. You do, however, get an extra main 6-inch triple turret, and it's set behind the 2 front ones in a layout that is very similar to the Miyoko class from the Japanese tree. And while this is a positive, it does make your front magazines much easier to hit. These guns do also turn much slower than the Fargo, almost as slow as many battleship turrets. And while those are all downsides, it does get the same main battery rounds and fire rate as Fargo. So they are still very good guns. The secondaries are downgraded though to match the previous heavy cruisers with 4 single barrel 5-inch guns per side. It has extremely light anti-aircraft firepower, having only a few machine guns as well, and has fairly poor firing arcs on the main guns. You have to show a lot of your broadside to fire them all. The gain of the extra 6-inch battery is somewhat negated by the downgrades on the ship, and it's almost more preferred in my opinion to have Fargo secondaries, anti-aircraft, and faster turning turrets for being aggressive and dodging against an enemy team. It does keep the float plane, but you have a lot of the same downsides as Fargo in that case, and is in some ways more vulnerable with that extra large front battery. So my rating on this thing is an 8 out of 10. The extra battery is nice, but it's not really worth the downgrades from Fargo in my opinion. Moving on, we have the USS Cleveland, also at 6.0. This is basically a bigger and more survivable Fargo that takes the spread out nature of Fargo's modules to its logical extreme. It has the same fast speed as Fargo and faster responses to your rudder inputs, but a massive turning circle for a cruiser, so it's pretty good at dodging and weaving, but if you have to turn the whole ship around to get out of an engagement, it's going to take you a while. The armor as well is similar to Fargo, relying mainly on the spread out modules to reduce collateral damage. And like I said with Fargo, many enemy hits will just pass through with no damage, and your magazines are fairly deep underwater, so they'll have a very hard time hitting them. Sometimes with this ship being completely broadside is your best bet against high penetration shells, especially from 7.0 battleships that you can face. This ship does also have a very high number of crew members. This can rival some battleships per count. So it makes it very survivable to just light hits across all of its deck modules. In terms of its anti-aircraft firepower, it does have less than Fargo, but it still puts up a very dangerous wall of fire at long ranges, which will ward off many planes. Now, as per your bread and butter for dealing damage, it keeps the exact same main 6-inch batteries and the exact same secondary 5-inch guns as Fargo in basically the same layout with very similar firing arcs. And on top of that, it gets the same shell selection as Fargo with the amazing base fuse high explosive shells. And it does keep its float plane, which can be handy in some scenarios on larger maps, but like I said with the previous two cruisers, it does leave you very vulnerable, and you are a light cruiser and battleships do like shooting at you. Anyways, my rating on this one is a 10 out of 10. It's a Fargo, but bigger and better. Up next we have the USS Pittsburgh, also at 6.0. This is the second largest cruiser of the line if you're not counting the battle cruisers, and is the last heavy cruiser we get in the line, as per the researchable heavy cruisers. Its speed is similar to the other US cruisers, being decently fast. Though it's not the most maneuverable, it has a wide turning circle and pretty slow acceleration. As far as survivability goes, it does improve upon the New Orleans armor scheme with additional armor and a full covering of anti-fragmentation armor on the hull, and the turrets are also way better protected frontally and on top, which will help them survive a lot longer, short of being hit with direct fire. The armor can help against early battleships and other heavy cruisers when angled, but the later battleships are really not going to care and are just going to rip through your hull. Even though this ship is a lot larger, it still doesn't get torpedo protection though, so it is kind of a downside there. The modules in this thing are fairly spread out, similar to Cleveland, which can prevent a lot of damage, and the magazines are placed rather deep, so they are somewhat hard to hit, though if you do show a broadside, most battleship players will find it fairly easy to sink a couple shots into your magazines if they're relying on their shells diving below your waterline. The crew size is pretty large, though Cleveland still has it beat in numbers, so it makes Cleveland a little bit more survivable than you. And as far as your anti-aircraft suite goes, you get a lot of slower firing 3-inch anti-aircraft guns with a massive range of just over 7 kilometers, and these things will engage ships up to and including light cruisers. These anti-aircraft guns are pretty good and can do significant damage when in range, but are also damaged extremely easily as they are in open turrets. As per your firepower, you get 2 triple 8-inch turrets in the front and 1 in the back, similar to New Orleans, and you have to show a lot of your ship to fire the rear turret forward, though the rearward angles on the front guns are a lot better. Though these turrets are improved, they still have a slow reload rate and slow traverse speed, being that they're only slightly faster than what you had on New Orleans. Though the guns are fairly accurate, they tend to only spread a bit horizontally at range, so they will still hit the enemy, they might just not hit where you wanted. The high explosive and semi-armor piercing shells are basically the same as New Orleans, though you do get an improved armor piercing round with slightly better penetration and double the explosive filler, which is pretty handy. Though despite the armor piercing round being improved, it doesn't really help them be more consistent as per dealing damage and penetrating targets. They are still fairly ineffective against most battleships, but despite your main battery not being improved, you do get the 6 dual 5-inch secondary batteries arranged just like Cleveland, with the typical 5-inch ammo that we know and love by now. These things definitely help you make up for the lacking main battery and are a massive help when you're stuck with a long reload of your 8-inch rounds. The only other downside of this ship is you don't get a float plane, though I'm not sure how useful it would be when many of the 7.0 battleships you see will just consider you food. My rating overall for the Pittsburgh is a 5 out of 10. It's the best researchable heavy cruiser, but it's really battleship food at its BR range, and the reload really lets it down. And rounding out 6.0, we have the USS Roanoke. This thing is a bigger and badder Atlanta, up-armed with 6-inch guns. It is the biggest researchable US cruiser currently by displacement if you're not counting the battle cruisers, though that does make it a slight issue because you are extremely long, which makes you easy to hit. As far as its maneuverability with that size, it keeps the same fast speed as the other US cruisers and responds to its rudder quickly, but does have a very long turning radius due to the length of the ship. It does, however, accelerate very well for its size, which is very helpful when you have less armor than Cleveland. But it is covered in anti-fragmentation armor that kinda makes up for it against smaller shells. It does rely heavily on spread out modules. They're even more spread out than Cleveland's, if you can believe that. And it has a massive crew count that rivals quite a few battleships. Though that crew count won't help you when the magazines are fairly large and fairly easy to hit, they are easily your biggest weak point on this ship. And sometimes just being fully broadside is your best bet with these spread out modules, though it does make your magazines a little bit easier to hit as people can just see exactly where your turrets are and fire right below them. I highly suggest using its speed to dodge enemy fire and maybe wiggling a little bit, as really you're not going to rely on turning around and running away, and just sitting broadside will eventually get somebody to hit your magazine. The ship also gets no torpedo protection despite its massive size, so expect torp hits to be quite devastating, especially if they land near magazines. Your anti-aircraft batteries aren't very strong on their own. They have a 4-kilometer range with only a handful of 20mm autocannons, so it's not really that scary to enemy ships. Another major positive of the ship, though, is similar to Mitscher. It has extremely fast target ranging and updates, so even if you're maneuvering a lot or the enemy is maneuvering a lot, it'll constantly be updating where you need to put your aim in order to hit them, which is very handy. As far as the main firepower goes, you get 6 dual 6-inch turrets as a main battery, with 3 in the front and 3 in the back, with the 3rd and 4th turrets super firing over the other 2. These turrets themselves have extremely fast traverse times equal to some destroyers and Atlanta, and the first and last guns rotate 360 degrees, which is extremely handy if you're switching sides in an engagement. The reload speeds, if you can believe it, are even faster than the other US light cruisers by a few seconds, so you can get even more damage downrange. The arcs of fire on them are fairly decent, but you do have to show a lot of your side to fire all your guns, and this is a fairly large ship, so it is kind of a downside. It's not great at firing straight over the bow or stern either, as only 2 turrets aren't blocked by each other in each case. And it does get the exact same shells as the other US 6.0 light cruisers, and can struggle against heavily armored battleships. As far as the secondaries go, though, they are 11 dual 3-inch cannons and 2 single 3-inch cannons on a ready rack system similar to Mitscher. so they'll have an extremely fast rate of fire when you start firing them, and slow down a bit once they run out of that ready rack, though it really doesn't slow down to where it's annoying. The shell arcs are also similar to the main batteries inside of 10 kilometers, but if you go beyond that, they tend to lag behind and kind of get a little less useful, especially since you can't really see them at that range. These guns do only get high explosive rounds, but I promise you they will rip apart any light ship, or if you're facing a heavier ship, it'll clear the deck of any secondary guns or anti-aircraft guns or modules that they have, and if they keep repairing it, that's just more food for you. You can always depend on at least a third of these guns firing at any angle, but similar to Pittsburgh's anti-aircraft guns, they are easily destroyed as they're just unshielded turrets. And in coupled with the main batteries, it can just create a terrifying rainbow of fire that will cause some ships to panic when they're looking at it coming towards them. My rating overall for this thing is a 10 out of 10. It is an extremely fun ship, rivaling Cleveland as the best light cruiser in the line. Up next we have our first battleship of the line with the USS North Dakota at 6.3. This is a surprisingly decent first battleship. I was quite surprised by how decent it was to play compared to other lines' first battleships. Though, as far as maneuverability goes, it is fairly sluggish on both speed and turning ability, though it does have a good turning circle for the size of the ship. As far as its survivability goes, it has a moderately low crew count, which will quickly dwindle with repeated damage from my experiences. Though it does have a decent amount of armor, the armor kind of fails against many of the ships that it can see. Heavy cruisers and a few battleship armor-piercing rounds can struggle against your side armor when you angle it, but if you are flat broadside or facing somebody bow on, your armor is very easily penetrated. In my opinion, your armor is weakest and flattest when shot straight through the bow or stern, so definitely don't point your bow at somebody and hope to survive. Your deck armor can also be penetrated by even light cruisers firing base fuse high explosive, as I found with Cleveland, and your magazines are also large and fairly close to the waterline, making you very easy to detonate. Though a positive of your layout is that the third turret is set back from the center of the ship, so it really helps against anybody aiming purely for midships using the indicator, and your magazine just won't be right under where the indicator is pointing them. As far as your anti-aircraft defense though, you have none. There is guns, but it's not a lot and they don't do very much. It's a pretty severe detriment at the tier, especially with how slow the ship is. So moving right on from that to the main firepower. It gets 10 12-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. 2 of these super fire forward on your bow, 2 of these super fire backwards on your aft, and the last of these is in between your 2 rear turrets facing forward. These turrets do have a decent rotation speed for a battleship, but they are slightly slower than Pittsburgh, so it might feel quite sluggish after being through all the light cruisers and even Pittsburgh. As far as their arcs of fire, they have okay forward arcs of fire before the turrets get blocked by each other, and of course your superstructure. But if you're trying to fire them to the rear, you need to be almost broadside to fire all your guns, which is kind of painful. The reload speed on these as well is slightly below average, needing about 35 seconds to reload between salvos, but thankfully they are decently accurate even at range, with somewhat longer shell flight times than other battleships. The shells do tend to plunge at the end of their arcs, so they're not really great for firing below the waterline. 9 times out of 10 you do want to actually hit the ship that you're aiming at rather than aim below the waterline, because your shells will do nothing. As with basically every ship in the line, these guns do start with high explosive rounds, and when you upgrade them they do get fairly mediocre armor piercing rounds that kind of struggle against heavily armored targets or anything that's angled. To support these main batteries you do get 14 5-inch secondaries and casemates along the ship, and they do have pretty good accuracy, though they do have a long reload time and you need to be near broadside to use all the ship's secondaries at once on that side of the ship. The 5-inch stock semi-armor piercing round isn't really that effective, and the AP round isn't great, but it can penetrate many light targets. The problem with this is it doesn't have a ton of explosive filler, so really don't expect them to decimate your targets. On the bright side, they do have the same shell travel times as the 12-inch guns, so you don't need to adjust your aim when you're just trying to hit your secondaries on something. And lastly, while this ship can get hull-mounted torpedoes, I really wouldn't bother with them as they're fairly useless and just add to your detonation chance. On top of that, you also don't get a float plane, which would be kinda handy with how slow the ship is. Overall, my rating for the North Dakota is a 6 out of 10. It is surprisingly decent for a start of battleships, especially after I went through the Japanese line with its fairly terrible ones. Stepping up from that, we have the USS Wyoming at 6.7. This does keep the speed and maneuverability that North Dakota had, but does have a wider turning circle due to being a larger ship overall. And on top of that, the ship is very slow in reverse and barely turns, so I would not suggest getting stuck on an island with this thing. As far as your survivability goes, you do have a lower crew count than North Dakota, and it's actually rather low for a battleship, and it loses crew quickly to damage overall. On top of that low crew count, your armor scheme is pretty much the same as North Dakota, but adds a little bit extra armor in some sections. The magazines are still right at the waterline and very massive, and the third turret is very close to midships, so it's very detonation prone, even more so than its predecessor. It does, however, gain torpedo protection, but this is fairly ineffective with how massive and close to the waterline the magazines are, so if you do take a torpedo, expect it to just pop you. The Wyoming also does get a little bit more anti-aircraft than its predecessor, being that it gains a handful of 3-inch cannons, but while they have good range, I would not expect them to stop any planes for you. Planes are basically your worst enemy in this thing. These guns will engage light cruisers and destroyer if they do get within range though, so they might slightly add to your damage. As far as its main battery goes, it does get 12 of the 12-inch guns and 6 twin turrets, with 2 super firing forward, 2 super firing in the midships, and 2 super firing aft. It's the same rotation speed on these turrets as North Dakota, so it's pretty slow, but it is decent for a battleship, and the forward firing arcs are decent as well, though the firing arcs to the rear are pretty terrible due to the superstructure blocking the bow turrets. These firing arcs can be blocked as well at some angles due to lifeboat cranes, and it makes it rather awkward to position, as sometimes you'll be angling your ship and one of your guns will just be blocked by a random piece of steel that's sticking up in front of the guns, so it is kind of annoying. As far as the reload for these guns go, it is more average, requiring only 32 seconds between salvos, and they have better penetration on the shells than the previous ship, though they will still struggle against heavily armored targets or angled ships. These shells also have faster velocity, making it have slightly less shell flight time and requiring a little bit less lead. You should, however, expect the damage to still be similar, as though they have more penetration, the new shells do have only slightly less explosive filler than the previous shells, and they do still plunge, so it's really not worth it to aim below the waterline, as they really won't get anything done. As far as the secondaries go, it gets 16 improved 5-inch casemate secondaries with 8 on each side of the ship. They retain the semi-armor piercing as its stock shell, plus an armor piercing upgrade. The improvements on these are a faster reload at 7.5 seconds and slightly better penetration. These secondaries have a good forward firing arc, allowing most of them to be fired while angled, though to the rear they're not as great. And lastly, the ship does have a bit of a quirk where it does have float planes modeled on it, though it doesn't get access to them, so you can't use them at all, which is kind of weird. Either way, my rating for this ship is a 6 out of 10. It's better than North Dakota, but is easy food for top tier battleships. Up next at 6.7 as well, we have the USS Texas, and while I love the ship in real life, in game it is not that great. It has similar slow speed and sluggish handling as the previous 2 battleships, and a long and slow turning circle, and keeping in line with Wyoming, it has a painfully slow reverse speed and barely turns, so I would highly suggest not getting in any situations that you have to reverse out of. Delving into its survivability, it does sport a large number of crew members, making it take a lot of repeated damage to sink, though the armor scheme is very similar to the previous ships, just thicker. It can bounce some battleship shells when angled, but it has all the weaknesses of the previous ships, as per being bow on or completely broadside. The magazines once again are still at the waterline and very large, and has a midships turret, making it very detonation prone. And while it does get torpedo protection, the magazine placement tends to mean that if you do take a torpedo, most likely it is just going to detonate you. But while the armor layout may let you down, the anti-aircraft definitely won't. This thing is absolutely covered in anti-aircraft guns of all varieties and will engage at long ranges. It basically turns itself into a veritable floating no-fly zone. Though I think that's its main positive, as it just gets more downsides as you move into the main battery. It gets 10 14-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, with 2 super firing forward, 2 super firing on its aft, and 1 in its midships. These guns have extremely slow traverse speeds even for a battleship, and on top of that these have abysmally slow reload speeds, taking 46 seconds between salvos to reload. And the guns can be wildly inaccurate at times for no apparent reason, which is extremely off-putting when you line up a really good shot. As far as the firing arcs go, you'll need to be basically broadside to get all guns on target, as they're blocked by a lot of your superstructures and anti-aircraft guns. Now, while you would think the 14-inch guns are a lot better than the 12-inch, you would be kinda wrong, and I've harped on this before and I'll harp on it a little bit here. The armor-piercing shells, while they have more penetration and way more explosive filler than the 12-inch guns, tend to not live up to their stats. They tend to not fully penetrate, they like to bounce off angled targets, and even when they do penetrate, they'll tend to lightly or moderately damage modules, turning them yellow or orange, rather than outright destroying them, even with repeated hits. And on top of that, the shells still plunge, leading to little or no damage if landed below the waterline. Overall, these are very frustrating guns to use, and you'll struggle to deal consistent damage with them, especially with the very long reload. Honestly, I bet I have more kills from the fires set by these guns rather than the guns themselves. Continuing the downsides of Texas, it gets an extremely small amount of secondaries, getting only 6 casemate 5-inch guns with 3 per side. They are the exact same guns that Wyoming had, and you need to be fully broadside to use all 3 on that side of the ship. Just the small amount of secondaries really adds to the pain of the terrible main batteries on this thing, and they will contribute very little damage to your overall total. Honestly, sometimes it's better to just swap to your anti-aircraft guns and use those as your secondaries at closer ranges. Similar to Wyoming, this thing also doesn't get a float plane despite having a catapult modeled. So yeah, overall my rating for this thing is a 2 out of 10. I do love the anti-aircraft that it has, but I'll take Wyoming over this thing, really. Wrapping up the 6.7s, we have the USS Nevada. This ship has similar speeds to the other battleships, with long, slow turns and extremely delayed responses to the rudder, requiring a full rudder movement to even start turning. It won't respond to any less, which is pretty annoying to use when you're trying to make small adjustments even just to get out of spawn. Though since you won't be dodging, thankfully the crew count is extremely high, letting you absorb a ton of damage. And the armor is fairly thick and effective and does a great job of protecting most of your critical modules. The only problem with this is your magazines aren't very deep underwater, but they are decently armored, so if somebody has enough penetration, they will definitely find them. The biggest weakness on the ship is the shell rooms, in my opinion, as they tend to get popped fairly easily, so be prepared to lose a turret and deal with the flooding that comes with that if somebody happens to sneak a shell into your shell rooms. Though thankfully with the layout change of this ship, the torpedo protection is fairly effective. Though any hits near the magazines are pretty much a guaranteed detonation, this ship is fairly resilient to flooding. If it does take an irreparable breach, it tends to flood to 50 or 60% and then just kind of sit there and not recover from that. So you might be sailing around with a crooked ship for a while. As far as the anti-aircraft firepower is concerned, this thing is basically covered in anti-aircraft guns with a good range of about 5 kilometers and does a great job of stopping any planes that are nearby to you. Moving on from that, you have the main batteries, where it gets 10 14-inch guns, same guns as Texas, and 2 triple and 2 twin turrets. The twin turrets superfire over the triples on either end of the ship, and they keep the extremely slow traverse speed and cripplingly slow reload speed as the USS Texas. The firing arcs on these guns also force you to show a lot of broadside in order to use all your guns, and at least they are well armored, tending not to be lost from shell fire, though your shell rooms will get popped and just lose them for you. As far as the shells are actually concerned, they are the same exact shells as Texas, with every poor characteristic that came with them. The only upgrade to this thing is the secondaries are the same as Fargo, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. They are the 5-inch twin turrets that we all know and love, and it gets 8 turrets with 4 mounted on either side of the ship, basically a destroyer strapped to each side of your ship. And the rapid reload rate is a nice change from the Texas and Wyoming. They do tend to get blocked by the AA guns if not fully broadside, but usually at least 2 of them can be fired at a time, giving you a decent amount of firepower throughout any of your maneuvers. They tend to be destroyed fairly easily though, so you will be constantly repairing them. These are basically just destroyer turrets after all, so if any ships at high tier basically look at them sideways, they will most likely get obliterated. They do get the typical 5-inch high explosive and semi-armor piercing rounds, and are very effective against light targets and can penetrate some battleships' decks, which is always a pleasant surprise. Though, they do require extra lead over what the main battery shells need, so it will take some getting used to adjusting your fire between reloads of your main battery in order to land hits with your secondary shells. This ship does get a float plane, which is very nice to take capture points, just because you're a very slow and cumbersome ship, so you can use that to go take points while you're shrugging off some damage, or if you're just sailing around doing nothing. My rating overall for this thing is a 6 out of 10. The weak shell rooms and the 14-inch guns really hold the ship back. Stepping it up now to 7.0, we start with the USS Alaska. And it's certainly a strong start, as I think this is the king of the US 7.0s, easily one of the best top tier ships in my opinion. It does have a massive size, but it is just as fast as the US cruisers, not the other battleships, and accelerates very well despite its massive size. It responds to its rudder well, but it does have a very long turning circle as the ship is fairly long. It does feel a lot like one of the cruisers in its maneuverability. And thankfully, while you're making those big long turns, your survivability is still pretty good as well. You do have less crew than Nevada, but you still have an extremely high amount overall. So this will help you survive repeated hits from other ships that aren't super critical hits without losing a ton of your crew percentage overall from each individual one. The armoring is less than the other battleships, but it is incredibly trolly when angled, and can bounce a lot of battleship shells if you're just slightly pointed off from them. It does not, however, take shots to its broadside well from other battleships. In the background I actually did a fairly poor job angling my ship, and you can see that I quickly took shots into my turrets and had one get disabled at one point. So you definitely have to pay attention to your angling a lot because it does not take shots to the side very well. The shell rooms and magazines are super easy to hit on these broadsides, which is what most people will aim for if they know what they're doing. The ship also gets no torpedo protection, but it does take them surprisingly well if you do take a hit that isn't near a turret. And it is surprisingly resilient to sinking by flooding and can survive with water up to the deck a lot of times, which is kind of funny because you're just a couple of guns poking out of the ocean and sailing around and shooting people. And jumping over to your anti-aircraft guns, this thing is covered in even more anti-aircraft than Nevada, making it virtually another no-fly zone with a 5-kilometer bubble around it. But when you're not swatting planes, you need to do something about those enemy ships. And thankfully you get 9 12-inch guns in 3 triple turrets. 2 of these fire forward, and 1 of them is on the aft. These turrets are fairly well armored frontally, but fairly weak on the sides and tops. So you do have to be aware of that when brawling, because you will lose them if they take a direct shell hit, or if somebody on the side of you that isn't what you're aiming at takes a shot to your turrets. They do have fast traverse times for a battleship, and are very easy to swing around. This is one of the only ships at these high tiers where I didn't immediately want to get the primary armament upgrade module, just because I already felt like they swung around fairly decently. As far as their firing arcs are concerned, the rear gun has fairly mediocre firing arcs forward, and the front guns have fairly poor arcs firing backwards, so expect you're not going to be using all of them all the time, especially when you're brawling something else. Also, you have to make a note that the foremost gun can be blocked by the bow if enemies are within 10 kilometers due to the raised nature of the bow. And if enemies get within 4 kilometers of you and your bow onto them, you basically won't be able to shoot any of your forward guns at them. So I would keep that in mind when you're actually trying to point the ship at targets, because you do have to angle in order to use your front batteries if they are close. Despite that, these guns do have an extremely fast reload for a battleship or battle cruiser at 23 seconds, and they are quite accurate. The shells have a similar penetration to the 14-inch shells on Nevada and Texas, but half the explosive filler. And they do tend to be way more consistent with damage and penetration, and the reload certainly helps with this. Just because if you do mess up a shot, or a shot doesn't decide to do what you wanted it to, you can just fire again in half the time that it takes a 14-inch shell to reload. These shells do tend to still prefer flat targets, but they are way less finicky, and they still do plunge, so they're not great for below waterline shots at range. The good things just keep on rolling with your secondaries, as you get 6 twin 5-inch batteries as secondaries, very similar to Nevada, but their layout is more like Pittsburgh or Cleveland. There's 2 centerline over the main batteries and 2 on either side as wing turrets. These secondaries have great firing arcs, and usually you can at least keep 3 on target, even when heavily angled, which is a decent amount of firepower going down range. These keep the same 5-inch shells that we know and love by now, though the one downside that I found was weird with this ship is you have to research both semi-armored piercing rounds in order to get the better shell. You're locked out of the better one until you research the first one. Similar to Nevada, these turrets are easily destroyed, but they are more spread out than Nevada's, so it won't be them getting destroyed all at once. You might just lose 1 or 2 at a time. And they do require the extra lead versus the main guns, just like you saw in Nevada, so there is that slight learning curve with them. On top of that all, Alaska does get a float plane, so as long as you're careful where your hull is angled while you're using it so that you're not leaving yourself vulnerable, you can use it to capture points on maps. My rating for the Alaska though is a straight 10 out of 10. This thing is an absolute blast to brawl with, and a powerhouse for its tier. Filling in the next slot at 7.0, we have the USS Arizona. This battleship has similar slow speed to the other US battleships, with a long, slow turning circle as well, and it requires a full rudder to turn and doesn't respond to small shifts in the rudder, very similar to Nevada. As far as the crew size goes, it's very close to North Dakota, so it's rather average for a battleship, and kind of weird that it's the same as the starting battleship, though the ship is very well armored and will take a lot of fire, as everything below the decks are very well defended. The shell rooms though are quite easy to hit, so be prepared to lose your turrets a lot, but the magazines themselves are very heavily armored. You can basically survive matches without any of your guns because every one of your shell room blew up, though it isn't very fun in my opinion. I mean, it is funny because you can just sit there and sail backwards angled at an enemy, and they basically can do nothing to you because as long as your deck modules aren't repaired, they won't be able to do anything to your critical modules below the deck, and therefore can't finish your crew off, but it's not very fun in the long term. As far as your torpedo protection is concerned, it is fairly decent, and your ship is fairly resistant to flooding or sinking from flooding. It will flood to about 50 to 60% and sit there permanently, and that's kind of a downside when you're this sluggish and you already have the downsides of the 14-inch guns. So it is a fairly high detriment to your play when you do take a torpedo and have to sit there at 50% flooded for the rest of the match. And as far as your anti-aircraft is considered, it's actually kind of interesting on this ship. It isn't great, but it gets 5-inch AA guns that have an extremely long range and fairly good accuracy. If they do hit a plane, it's basically going to swat it out of the sky, and it will shoot them or shoot at them from basically across the match, but they do have a fairly slow firing rate and not a high volume of them, so it's kind of hit or miss whether it'll actually take a plane down. The other thing is these will engage basically everything on the map, and most of the time during the matches you have no idea what these are shooting at, but they're lobbing shells across the match. So I'd highly suggest just letting them do their thing, and maybe every once in a while they'll add a bit of damage to your total. As far as your main firepower goes, you get 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets with 2 super firing forward and 2 super firing aft. These turrets are fairly well armored, needing direct hits from battleships to basically destroy them, though like I said, your shell rooms will take them out first. These turrets do however have the same terrible traverse speed and abysmal reload speed as Nevada and Texas, and the same exact frustrating shells as those 2 ships as well. These shells really still don't like to consistently penetrate or damage targets, and they still plunge, so you can't really do below the waterline shots. The firing arcs both forward and backwards on the ship though are great for a battleship, allowing you to stay angled no matter what you're engaging and trying to angle towards. And over Texas you get 12 5-inch secondaries in open casemates with 6 per side, and they are the same guns as Texas and Wyoming. The 7-second reload does feel rather slow compared to Nevada's secondaries though. And the other downside of all these secondaries is they tend to be fairly easily destroyed due to being in open casemates. They basically have no armor. You have to be almost broadside to get most of these secondaries on targets, as most of them have bad rearward firing arcs, but thankfully you can engage forward with the majority of the ones on each side of a ship. The Arizona does also get a float plane, which is useful with how slow and ponderous the ship is, and you are fairly armored, so you can survive some hits if you happen to take them while you're using your float plane. Overall, my rating for this thing is a 4 out of 10. It doesn't really feel like a 7.0 outside of its armor values. And last but certainly not least, we have the USS Tennessee, also at 7.0. This thing is basically an improved Nevada. It has similar speeds to Nevada with the same long, slow turning circle, though it does respond to the rudder better, but it still requires a lot of rudder movement to actually turn. It also has similar crew counts to Nevada as well, keeping up with the survivability of its predecessor, and on top of that it's even more heavily armored and can take a massive beating and not be internally damaged. This is still best when angled, but survives a lot even when relatively broadside. On top of that, the shell rooms are way better protected and definitely doesn't lose them as often, if very often at all. The magazines as well are also deeper and more heavily reinforced, so you'll hardly ever have to worry about getting detonated with this thing. The Tennessee keeps the same good torpedo protection and flooding characteristics as Nevada as well, so it's all positives for the survivability. As far as the anti-aircraft gun goes, this thing does add a few extra anti-aircraft guns over what Nevada had, so you're basically creating another 5-kilometer floating no-fly zone. As far as the main battery is concerned though, it does get 12 longer 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets with 2 super firing forwards and 2 super firing aft. These still have the same extremely slow traverse speeds and reload rates as the other 14-inch battleships, and the forward firing arcs for the rear guns aren't very great, forcing you to be mostly broadside if you want to use them. The bow guns however do have a fairly good rearward firing arc. Tennessee does get different armor piercing rounds than the other 14-inch battleships, and these armor piercing shells trade a third of their explosive filler for penetration, and they are more consistent with damage and penetration than the other 14-inch battleships' shells, but they're still not really great. They also still plunge at the end of their arcs, making below the waterline shots fairly useless, especially at ranges, though it is made up for with the same 5-inch twin secondaries as Nevada in the exact same configurations. These also have similar arcs of fire as Nevada's, and you can basically always have at least 2 secondary turrets on a target, or if you're broadside you can have all 4. These 5-inch secondaries of course get the standard 5-inch semi-armor piercing and high explosive rounds, which are always very useful, and they will require more lead than the main batteries, but that really shouldn't be a problem if you've already played through Nevada and learned it from that ship's grind. Tennessee also gets a float plane as well, which is pretty handy since your ship is so slow, and since you're very well armored, you can just kinda tank shots while you're flying your plane around and not really care. My rating on this thing is a 7 out of 10. You can just tank everything in the world and not really care about it and just keep fighting back. And that wraps up my review of the US Naval Tree. I really think that this line is fairly fun, even though it does have its low points, mainly with the 14-inch battleships and the heavy cruisers. But overall, I think it's a great line for people to start learning on, as the destroyers have that rapid rate of fire, and they can really learn to adjust their aim for the lead times with the longer shell flights that those shells have, and it'll make the other lines a lot easier. I still, however, feel like this line has a lot of holes in it, as the top tier feels rather weak outside of Tennessee and Alaska, and obviously it has no Des Moines in the line whatsoever, despite, like I said before, there being one that's an event and one that's a premium. They literally could just copy and paste it into the line and make everybody a lot happier about that US heavy cruiser grind. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed, I hope it helped, and good luck out there.